Avery Johnson had always been invisible. The quiet passenger in seat 14B, reading a book while everyone else complained about the delayed flight. She wore a simple sweater, carried a worn paperback, and hadn't said a word to anyone in 3 hours. When the armed terrorists burst through the cockpit door, Avery didn't scream like the others. She just closed her book, stood up slowly, and whispered something that made the nearest SEAL team member's blood run cold. "Tell me you still have that tactical knife in your boot." That's when everyone realized the quiet passenger wasn't who she appeared to be. Flight 447 from Chicago to Denver had been delayed 2 hours due to mechanical issues, leaving 180 passengers frustrated and restless in the boarding area of O'Hare International Airport. Avery Johnson sat alone near Gate B12, completely absorbed in a dog-eared copy of The Count of Monte Cristo, her auburn hair falling across her face like a curtain that separated her from the world around her. At 26 years old, Avery had perfected the art of invisibility. Standing 5 feet 4 inches with a slender build and wearing a simple gray sweater over dark jeans, she looked like any other tired traveler trying to get home after a long business trip. For 5 years after her father's death, Avery had served with the 75th Ranger Regiment, earning commendations for her performance in Afghanistan and Iraq. She'd specialized in close-quarters combat, tactical reconnaissance, and what the military euphemistically called direct action, missions where killing was not just acceptable, but required. But 18 months ago, after a mission went wrong in a way that still gave her nightmares, Avery had resigned her commission and disappeared into civilian life. Now she worked as a freelance cybersecurity consultant, using her analytical skills and attention to detail to help corporations protect their digital assets. It was quiet work, safe work, work that didn't require her to make life or death decisions or carry weapons that could end someone's existence in milliseconds. She'd sworn to herself that she would never kill again, no matter the circumstances. When Flight 447 finally began boarding, Avery was among the last passengers to enter the aircraft. She moved through the boarding process with practiced efficiency, keeping her head down and avoiding eye contact with other passengers. Her seat in 14B was a middle seat between a businessman who smelled like cheap cologne and an elderly woman who immediately fell asleep against the window. As the plane taxied toward the runway, Avery noticed something that made her trained instincts activate despite her best efforts to remain oblivious. 3 men sitting in rows, 11 and 12, were exhibiting behavior patterns that immediately identified them as military personnel attempting to blend in with civilians. The first was in 11A, a man in his early 30s with short-cropped hair and the kind of posture that never fully relaxes. His eyes constantly scanned the cabin, cataloging faces and potential threats with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to expect danger in any environment. Despite wearing civilian clothes, his movements were precise, economical, and spoke to years of military discipline. In 11C sat another man, slightly older, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent significant time in desert climates. He wore a baseball cap pulled low, but Avery could see the tan lines around his eyes that came from years of wearing military-issue sunglasses. His hands, resting on the armrests, bore small scars consistent with demolitions, training, and combat operations. The third man, in 12A, was the most obvious. Despite his attempts to look casual in jeans and a polo shirt, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a senior non-commissioned officer. His eyes held the 1,000-yard stare that came from seeing too much combat, and when he adjusted his position, Avery caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a tactical knife concealed in his boot. These were special operations personnel, almost certainly Navy SEALs based on their age, physical conditioning, and the subtle way they communicated with each other through brief eye contact and minimal gestures. They were traveling in civilian clothes without weapons, probably returning from a classified mission that required them to maintain cover identities until they reached their destination. Avery forced herself to look away and return to her book. This wasn't her concern anymore. She was a civilian now, a cybersecurity consultant who helped companies secure their networks and databases. Whatever mission these SEALs were returning from, whatever secrets they carried, it had nothing to do with her. She had left that world behind, left the violence and death and impossible choices that came with special operations. The flight took off smoothly, climbing through scattered clouds into clear skies above the Midwest. For the first hour, everything was routine. The flight attendants served drinks and snacks, passengers read magazines or dozed, and the airplane hummed steadily westward at 35,000 feet. Avery lost herself in her book, trying to ignore the familiar hyper-awareness that made her catalog every sound, every movement, every change in the aircraft's environment. It was exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes into the flight when everything changed. The first indication of trouble was subtle, a change in the rhythm of the aircraft's engines that most passengers wouldn't notice, but that immediately caught Avery's attention. The plane was descending slightly, not enough to trigger passenger concern, but enough to suggest the pilots were responding to some kind of instruction or emergency. The second indication came 30 seconds later, when the cockpit door opened and a flight attendant emerged, walking quickly toward the back of the plane with the kind of forced calm that suggested controlled panic. Avery watched her pass, noting the tension in her shoulders, the slightly too fast pace of her steps, the way her eyes avoided making contact with passengers. The third and final indication came when 5 men wearing dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be automatic weapons emerged from various parts of the cabin simultaneously. They moved with military precision, taking control of different sections of the aircraft in a coordinated operation that spoke to extensive planning and professional training. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced the leader, a bearded man in his 40s who positioned himself at the front of the cabin, "this aircraft is now under our control. If you remain calm and follow instructions, no one will be harmed. If you attempt to resist or create problems, people will die." The cabin erupted into chaos. Passengers screamed, children began crying, and several people immediately reached for their cell phones before being ordered to put their hands where they could be seen. The terrorists moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, zip-tying the hands of passengers and searching for anyone who might pose a threat to their operation. Avery remained perfectly still, her book still open in her lap, her expression unchanged. But internally, her mind was racing through tactical assessments and threat evaluations with the lightning speed that had kept her alive through dozens of combat operations. 5 hostiles, all armed with what appeared to be compact submachine guns. Professional movement patterns suggesting extensive training, possibly military backgrounds. Coordinated timing indicating significant pre-operational planning. Most concerning of all, they seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. You, and you," the leader called out, pointing directly at the 3 men in rows, 11 and 12, that Avery had identified as SEALs. "Stand up slowly and move to the front of the cabin." The SEALs exchanged brief glances, and Avery could see the frustration and anger in their eyes. They were among the most dangerous men in the world, capable of eliminating these terrorists in seconds under normal circumstances. But they were unarmed, surrounded by innocent civilians, and trapped in a confined space where any aggressive action could result in mass casualties. As the terrorists zip-tied the SEALs' hands behind their backs, Avery realized that this wasn't a random hijacking. The terrorists had known exactly where the Special Operations Team was sitting, had planned this operation specifically to neutralize them first. That meant they had intelligence about the SEALs' mission, their travel plans, possibly even their identities. "We know who you are," the leader said quietly to the senior SEAL, close enough that Avery could hear despite being 3 rows away. "We know what you took from our facility in Yemen. We know you're carrying classified materials back to your government. This operation isn't about the plane or the passengers. It's about you." The SEAL's expression remained neutral, but Avery could see the calculation in his eyes. These terrorists weren't interested in political statements or ransom demands. They were after something specific, something the SEAL team had recovered during their mission, and they were willing to kill 180 innocent people to get it. One of the terrorists began moving through the cabin, systematically searching passengers and confiscating anything that could potentially be used as a weapon. Cell phones, laptops, even pens and nail files were being collected in plastic bags. When he reached Avery's row, she looked up from her book with the wide-eyed expression of a frightened civilian. "Hands where I can see them," the terrorist ordered. Avery slowly closed her book and raised her hands, allowing him to search her small carry-on bag. He found nothing more threatening than travel-sized toiletries and a change of clothes. As he moved on to the next row, Avery caught the eye of the senior SEAL, who was watching her with an expression of professional interest. For just a moment, their eyes locked, and Avery saw recognition flicker across his face. Not recognition of her personally, but recognition of something in her posture, her controlled breathing, the way she was cataloging the terrorists' positions and weapons with the systematic thoroughness of someone trained to fight. 20 minutes passed in tense silence as the terrorists consolidated their control of the aircraft. The passengers were ordered to remain seated with their hands visible, while the cockpit crew was forced to maintain course toward Denver under the supervision of one of the hijackers who apparently had sufficient aviation knowledge to monitor their actions. It was during this lull that Avery made her decision. She had noticed something the terrorists had missed in their initial sweep of the cabin. The senior SEAL, despite having his hands zip-tied behind his back, had managed to work his tactical knife partially out of his boot. It was a small movement, invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it, but it told Avery that the SEALs were preparing to make their move despite the overwhelming odds against them. The problem was that any conventional assault would result in massive casualties. The terrorists were positioned to have clear fields of fire down the length of the cabin, and their automatic weapons could kill dozens of passengers in seconds. The SEALs knew this, which was why they were waiting, hoping for an opportunity that might never come. But Avery could create that opportunity. She stood up slowly, her book falling from her lap to the floor. The nearest terrorist immediately swung his weapon toward her, shouting for her to sit back down. Instead of complying, Avery raised her hands in apparent surrender and began walking toward him with the hesitant steps of a terrified civilian. "Please," she said, her voice shaking with what sounded like fear. "I need to use the bathroom. I'm pregnant, and I can't hold it much longer." The terrorist hesitated, glancing toward his leader for guidance. In that moment of indecision, Avery moved. Her transformation was instantaneous and shocking. The frightened civilian disappeared, replaced by a predator who moved with lethal precision. In one fluid motion, she grabbed the terrorist's weapon, twisted it upward and away from the passengers, and drove her knee into his solar plexus with enough force to lift him off his feet. Before the other terrorists could react to this impossible development, Avery had stripped the submachine gun from the first man's hands and was already engaging the second hostile. Her movements were economical, professional, and absolutely deadly. Each shot was precisely placed, each action calculated to minimize risk to the civilian passengers while maximizing damage to the terrorist threat. The leader of the terrorist group managed to get off a burst of automatic fire, but his shots went wide as Avery dropped to the floor and rolled between the seat rows. From her prone position, she had clear sight lines to 3 of the remaining hostiles while being shielded from return fire by the aircraft's structure. "Get down! Everyone get down!" she shouted to the passengers, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in combat situations. The senior SEAL, recognizing that his opportunity had arrived, managed to retrieve his tactical knife and cut his zip-tie restraints. Within seconds, he had freed his teammates, and the 3 special operations personnel were moving through the cabin with the coordinated precision of a well-trained team. But it was Avery who dominated the engagement. Moving through the aircraft like a force of nature, she systematically eliminated the terrorist threat with a combination of precision shooting, hand-to-hand combat techniques, and tactical awareness that left the SEALs staring in professional admiration. The entire firefight lasted less than 90 seconds. When it was over, all 5 terrorists were down, the passengers were safe, and Avery Johnson was standing in the center aisle with an empty weapon in her hands and the expression of someone who had just done something she'd sworn she would never do again. The senior SEAL approached her cautiously, his tactical knife still in his hand but lowered in a non-threatening position. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I'm Chief Petty Officer Marcus Reynolds, United States Navy. I need to know who you are and how you acquired those skills." Avery looked at him for a long moment before setting the empty submachine gun on an empty seat. "Sergeant First Class Avery Johnson, 75th Ranger Regiment, retired." She paused, her voice becoming quieter. "Daughter of Colonel Michael Reaper Johnson." Recognition flickered across Reynolds's face. "Your father trained half the special operations community, including me. He was a legend." He gestured toward the neutralized terrorists. "That was some of the finest combat work I've ever witnessed." "Where have you been for the last 18 months? "Trying to be invisible," Avery replied, the weight of what had just happened beginning to settle on her shoulders. "Trying to live a normal life where I don't have to kill people." "Well," Reynolds said, looking around at the passengers who were slowly beginning to realize they were safe, "I'd say you just saved about 180 lives. Your father would be proud." As the aircraft continued its descent toward Denver, Avery found herself surrounded by passengers who wanted to thank her, to touch her, to somehow express their gratitude for what she had done. But she felt hollow, empty, as if something fundamental inside her had been broken all over again. She had kept her promise to herself for 18 months. She had lived quietly, harmlessly, causing no deaths and taking no lives. But when the moment of crisis came, when innocent people were threatened, her training and instincts had taken over completely. She had become the warrior her father had trained her to be, whether she wanted to or not. The plane landed at Denver International Airport surrounded by emergency vehicles, FBI agents, and military personnel who had been alerted to the situation during the hijacking. As passengers were evacuated and debriefed, Avery found herself in a private room with Chief Reynolds and several other officials who wanted to understand exactly what had happened at 35,000 feet. "The terrorists knew we were on that plane," Reynolds explained during the debriefing. "They knew our mission, our route, probably our identities. This was a targeted operation designed to recover classified materials we were transporting back from Yemen." "What kind of materials?" Avery asked. Reynolds exchanged glances with the other officials before answering. "Intelligence documents related to a terrorist cell that's been planning attacks on military installations across the United States. The information we recovered could prevent dozens of attacks and save hundreds of lives." Avery nodded, understanding the implications. The terrorists who had hijacked the plane weren't random criminals or political extremists. They were part of a larger network that had been willing to kill innocent civilians to protect their operational security. By stopping them, she had potentially saved many more lives than just the 180 passengers on Flight 447. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would change her life once again. "Now," Agent Carter said, leaning back in her chair, "we offer you a choice that very few people ever get to make. You can return to your quiet life as a cybersecurity consultant, helping corporations protect their networks while trying to forget the violence you're capable of. We'll ensure your involvement in today's events remains classified, and you can go back to being invisible." She paused, studying Avery's reaction before continuing. "Or you can accept what today has proven, that you are exactly who your father trained you to be. A warrior whose skills can make the difference between life and death when innocent people are threatened. The war on terror isn't over, and there are threats out there that only someone with your unique combination of abilities and moral clarity can handle." Reynolds spoke up, his voice carrying the weight of command authority. "What Agent Carter isn't telling you is that we desperately need someone like you. Someone who can operate in civilian environments without raising suspicion, who has the tactical skills to handle situations that conventional law enforcement can't manage, and who has the moral compass to make the right decisions when everything is on the line. The Damascus network isn't going to stop because we disrupted one operation," one of the FBI agents added. "They have cells operating across the country, they have sources inside our own government, and they're planning attacks that could kill thousands of Americans. We need every advantage we can get to stop them." Avery listened to their arguments, feeling the weight of expectation and duty settling on her shoulders like a familiar burden. Part of her wanted to walk away, to return to her quiet apartment and her consulting work and her books. But another part of her, the part her father had shaped through years of training and discipline, knew that she could never truly escape from who she was meant to be. "If I agreed to this," she said carefully, "what would it involve exactly?" Agent Carter smiled for the first time since the debriefing had begun. "You would become part of a classified program that doesn't officially exist. Your cover would remain as a cybersecurity consultant, which actually provides perfect justification for traveling to various locations and accessing sensitive facilities. But your real mission would be to identify and neutralize terrorist threats that conventional authorities can't handle." "You'd work alone most of the time," Reynolds added. "No team backup, no official support, no recognition if things go well, and no rescue if things go wrong. But you'd have access to intelligence resources and equipment that most special operations units can only dream of. And," Agent Carter concluded, "you'd be preventing attacks that could kill hundreds or thousands of innocent Americans. Children who would grow up safe because of actions you took, decisions you made, skills you used to protect them." The room fell silent as Avery considered the offer. Through the small window in the debriefing room, she could see normal people going about their normal lives, travelers rushing to catch flights, families reuniting after separations, business people focused on meetings and deadlines. All of them blissfully unaware of the threats that existed in the shadows, the enemies who planned their destruction, the thin line of dedicated professionals who stood between civilization and chaos. "I need some time to think about it," she finally said, though she suspected she already knew what her answer would be. 3 weeks later, Avery found herself standing in front of her father's grave at Arlington National Cemetery. The headstone was simple, bearing only his name, rank, and dates of service. But she knew that beneath that simple marker lay a man who had dedicated his life to protecting others, even when it meant putting himself in harm's way. "I tried to walk away, Dad," she said quietly to the gravestone. "I really tried to be someone else. But when those people needed help, when innocent lives were at stake, I became exactly who you trained me to be." She paused, her voice becoming stronger. "I think that's what you would have wanted." 6 months later, Lieutenant Avery Johnson was assigned to a classified special operations unit that specialized in counterterrorism operations on American soil. Her official cover was as a cybersecurity consultant who traveled frequently for business, allowing her to maintain her civilian identity while serving her country in ways that would never appear in official records. Her first assignment was to investigate a series of security breaches at defense contractors across the Midwest. Her second was to provide protection for a federal judge who was receiving death threats. Her third was to neutralize a terrorist cell that was planning to attack a military base in Texas. Each mission reminded her that there were threats in the world that required someone with her specific combination of skills and dedication. Each successful operation saved lives and prevented attacks that would have caused immeasurable suffering. And each time she returned from a mission, she felt the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing she was following in her father's footsteps. Her fourth assignment took her to Seattle, where intelligence suggested a Damascus network cell was planning to attack the Space Needle during a major tourist event. Working undercover as a cybersecurity consultant hired to upgrade the facility's digital security systems, Avery spent 3 weeks identifying the terrorist operatives and mapping their operational structure. When she finally moved against them, it was with the same precise, devastating efficiency she had displayed on Flight 447. The fifth mission brought her back to the Midwest, where a series of suspicious accidents at defense contractors suggested sabotage operations designed to delay production of critical military equipment. Avery's investigation uncovered a network of foreign agents who had been systematically infiltrating American defense companies for over 2 years. Her report led to the largest counter-espionage operation in recent FBI history. By her 6th month in the program, Avery had developed a reputation within the intelligence community as someone who could handle impossible situations with minimal collateral damage and maximum effectiveness. Her success rate was unprecedented, her tactical skills were legendary, and her ability to operate in civilian environments without detection was unmatched. But it was during her 7th mission that everything almost went wrong. The assignment seemed routine. Investigate reports of suspicious activity at a technology conference in Las Vegas, where several defense contractors were displaying new equipment. Intelligence suggested that Damascus network operatives might be planning to steal classified technical specifications or plant surveillance devices. What Avery discovered instead was the assassination plot targeting the Secretary of Defense, who was scheduled to deliver the conference's keynote address. The operation was more sophisticated than anything the Damascus network had attempted before, involving multiple teams of professional killers and a detailed escape plan that would have allowed them to disappear into the chaos of Las Vegas. The problem was timing. Avery identified the threat only hours before the secretary was scheduled to speak, and conventional security protocols would have required canceling the entire event, something that would alert the terrorist network that their operation had been compromised. Instead, Avery made the decision to handle the situation herself. Working alone, she systematically neutralized each assassination team while maintaining her cover as a cybersecurity consultant attending the conference. The operation required her to move through the crowded convention center, eliminating professional killers without creating panic among the thousands of civilians present. It was the most challenging mission of her career, requiring every skill her father had taught her and every lesson she had learned during her time with the Rangers. When it was over, the Secretary of Defense delivered his speech as scheduled, completely unaware that his life had been saved by a woman in the audience who looked like any other technology professional attending the conference. But the mission had cost her. One of the assassination teams had managed to wound her before she eliminated them, and she barely made it back to her hotel room before collapsing from blood loss. It was only through sheer determination and her military medical training that she managed to treat her injuries and maintain her cover until she could be extracted. The transformation that had begun on Flight 447 was now complete. Avery Johnson was no longer trying to be invisible, no longer trying to escape from who she really was. She was her father's daughter, a warrior who used her skills to protect innocent people from those who would harm them. And somewhere over the skies of America, on commercial flights and in airport terminals and in all the places where ordinary people lived their ordinary lives, there were terrorists and criminals and enemies of freedom who had no idea that the quiet woman reading a book in seat 14B might be the most dangerous person on the plane. Sometimes the greatest weapons are the ones nobody sees coming. Sometimes the most effective warriors are the ones who look like everyone else. And sometimes, when everything seems hopeless and the odds are impossible, salvation comes from the quiet passenger who's been invisible all along. Avery Johnson had learned to embrace both sides of her identity. The cybersecurity consultant who lived quietly and the special operations warrior who emerged when she was needed most. She was living proof that heroes don't always announce themselves, that strength doesn't always come with uniforms and medals, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people whose names will never appear in history books. On her most recent flight from Denver to Washington, D.C., Avery sat in her familiar position, middle seat, book in hand, invisible to everyone around her. But now she carried something different, a small silver pendant that had belonged to her father, engraved with the Ranger motto, "Rangers lead the way." It was a reminder of who she was, who she had always been meant to be. As the plane cruised at altitude, she noticed two men in business suits exhibiting the subtle behavioral patterns she had learned to recognize. Not terrorists this time, but federal agents conducting surveillance on a passenger 3 rows ahead. She observed their operation with professional interest, noting their techniques and wondering if they were part of the same shadow war she now fought. When the flight landed, Avery walked through the terminal like any other traveler. But in her carry-on bag, along with her laptop and spare clothes, was an encrypted phone that would soon receive her next assignment. another threat to investigate, another operation to stop, another group of innocent people to protect. The war continued, and she was ready for it. Her father would have been proud of the woman she had become, not just a warrior, but a guardian who stood watch in the shadows, keeping America safe one mission at a time. The passengers of Flight 447 would remember her for the rest of their lives as the woman who saved them from certain death. But to Avery, she was simply doing what her father had trained her to do, protecting innocent people from those who would harm them, no matter the personal cost. That was her mission. That was her purpose. That was who she was meant to be, and she was finally at peace with it. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, you can subscribe to see more incredible stories like this one.